Welcome back to another episode of Untangling Climate Finance. I'm Jay Tipton and honored to be your host. So today's episode is a little bit different. Rather than bringing in an outside guest, I'm keeping it in-house and turning the lens on a conference that I think is genuinely one of the most significant climate governance moments that we've seen outside of a COP, if not more significant. In late April, 57 countries gathered in Santa Marta, Colombia for the first international conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels. Now, this wasn't just another round of diplomatic wordsmithing. It was a room full of doers treating fossil fuel phase-out as a practical, governable finance challenge, and the outcomes reflect that. So to unpack what it all means, I'm joined by two people who don't need much of an introduction around here. The first, Sean Penrith, the CEO of Gordian Strategies, and he's back for his third appearance on the show. We're also joined for the very first time by Kerry Morrison, GKS's Director of Strategic Engagement, and the person whose idea was to dedicate an entire episode to Santa Marta. All right, that's it. Let's get into it. All right, Sean, welcome back to the show for the third time. It's been way too long. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Jay. Good to be back. And it's really good timing because of this event at the Santa Marta convening. For me, it was powerful because we saw literally through the dialogue there. Of course, I wasn't there in person, but the dialogue moved from rhetoric to what seems to be real architecture. And the fact that these countries came together treating this real transition away from fossil fuels as a practical finance problem rather than all of these glib sort of diplomatic phrases that we keep on seeing every year at the COP, the annual climate conference that comes up.
Couldn't agree more. A very different outcome as well. So great to have you on, Sean. And also on today's episode, we're joined by Kerry Morrison, who is Gordian Strategies Director of Strategic Engagement and the architect of this episode's idea. So Kerry, how are things your direction?
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me on today, gentlemen. And I've just been really inspired by the concept for actually having this conference and for the outcomes. And you can just see that the people that have attended there really wanted to be there. It doesn't look like something where people were paid to, forced to go because they needed to send a delegation. These people really wanted to work together, and I'm inspired to support that conversation however we can.
Yep. And looking forward to your thoughts on this because as Sean and I both know, you've written about some of the topics that are being discussed here numerous times. So, of course, you're going to have some good thoughts. But anyways, to set the stage a bit, as Sean and Kerry alluded to, today we're discussing the first international conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which was held at the end of April in Santa Marta, Colombia. The conference included 57 countries, which represents roughly a third of the global economy. And they were all gathered there to treat fossil fuel phase out not as a taboo, but as a practical, governable transition challenge. So that's what we're going to talk about. And Sean, I'm going to start with you. As I just said, 57 countries, a third of the global economy, but only about 15% of global fossil fuel production was actually in the room. So for capital allocators who haven't yet repriced their sovereign corporate exposure to managed fossil decline, is this signal strong enough to move risk models on its own? Or is it more useful as political cover for institutions that were already inclined to act?
Yeah, really good question. And let me get to the signal strength in a second. I just wanted to touch on one thing around Santa Marta, which is really important, is that these participating countries who all voluntarily showed up, the format was incredibly unique. It was really a discussion style compared to these normal negotiating tactic gatherings. And they exhibited very clear thinking, linking fossil fuel dependence not just to the greenhouse gas emissions, but importantly to price volatility, the fiscal fragility that we're facing currently right now, trade exposure, and most importantly, long-term economic resilience. So back to your question, is it a strong enough signal? I don't think it's strong enough yet on its own to really underwrite wholesale repricing across sovereign and corporate balance sheets. But it is definitely strong enough to change the direction of travel. And that's the part that really motivates me or gives me heart. And that is that this convening created a very credible, clear political signal that active management of fossil fuel decline isn't just a fringe proposition. It's actually part of the mainstream transition governance. It is a real conversation. And so for capital allocators, that matters in two ways. One, it gives those early movers, such as development banks, blended finance platforms, credit agencies, and transition-focused private investors, way more confidence that they are aligning with an emerging policy consensus rather than acting in isolation. And we can see how, to be honest, we've had voices that are muted in this current environment. Second, it begins to establish a critical reference point for future country screening. We will be able to see which jurisdictions are preparing and are transparently disclosing that they're managing for a managed decline of fossil fuel dependence, and which are doubling down on the exposure to this class of stranded assets. So I'd say, the signal, it's not quite sufficient for repricing, but it's certainly sufficient for mandate formation. It gives the institutions the political cover, for sure, but more importantly, it gives them analytical justification to begin asking the harder questions about fossil revenue dependence, subsidy lock-ins, and resilience under the repeated energy shocks that we're all familiar with today. And so that's where this opportunity lies. The institutions that move first will not do so because Santa Marta specifically solved everything, but they will move because and this is a pivotal piece, because it made inaction look less prudent, particularly in a world still shaped by recurrent fossil fuel price volatility and the geopolitical disruption that's facing us all.
Wow.
Very well said. And although you're right, I totally agree. It's not the 100% signal that you expect, but it is a very strong signal nonetheless. And I think just having it on paper and having a name connected to it, a name on the sovereign level, definitely is a signal that a lot of people are paying attention to. So well said, Sean. And this leads me into my next question, which is about what actually makes a national roadmap investable. You recently posted on LinkedIn and you made the point that Paris-aligned ambition, so 1.5 degrees Celsius, is meaningless without country-level transition plans. And I know that you have worked on the sovereign level with countries and their ministries, not necessarily on their transition plans, but on plans at a high level. So if we look at what came out of Santa Marta, France brought their national plan to the table. Colombia and Brazil are currently drafting theirs. And so if you look at this from a financier's seat, what separates an investable roadmap from an aspirational one?
Yeah, great question. So any credible roadmap, an investable roadmap, must have three qualities. Deutsche Bank framed it slightly differently with their TLC formula. I'm going to explain it through having the following three characteristics or qualities. 1, credibility. 2, specificity. 3, financial translation. So the key here, and I'm going to state the obvious, is that a roadmap, it's not investable because it says the right things. It's investable because it shows, and here's the thing, a plausible sequencing of policy, capital needs, and institutional responsibilities covered with social protections in the long term. And so first, when we look for credibility, what we mean is that the plan or the roadmap is anchored solidly, incredibly, and transparently in the political economy of that host country. It needs to be absolutely transparent and honest about export dependence, reliance on fossil rents, workforce transition issues, infrastructure realities. And so Santa Marta was important because the conversation really emphasized that these roadmaps need to be connected to the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution, or the country plan under the Paris Agreement. And these roadmaps need to be honest about the level of exported emissions and the national dependent infrastructures. The second point is being specific about the fact that there is a real pathway. So what this means is being able to legibly see what is being phased down, over what timeline, using which compensating investments, under which agencies, and with what support from a blend of public finance, private capital, or concessional. And this is where roadmaps critically move away from aspiration to real pipeline. And then the third is financial translation. And what we mean here is that an investor or a lender can see where the risk is reduced and where capital can strategically enter. So when you look at Colombia's draft pathway, it's useful because they frame the transition not only as climate action, but as an economic story with upfront investment needs and long-term savings. And so that kind of framing is essential because finance doesn't just fund ambition. It funds structured transition pathways with measurable returns, protections, and governance. So the test, when you boil that all down, it's quite simple. If the roadmap cannot be read by a finance ministry or a development bank or a project sponsor as a document that identifies real policy signals, real instruments, real bankable opportunities, then it's still aspirational.
Indeed. Kerry, any reaction to that?
In this, I'm more just inspired by the reasons that people have come together. And I understand the need for these policy frameworks, and this is the solid ground that we need to act upon. And what we feel here different at Santa Marta versus the COP conferences, such as in Belém, is a determined framework conversation about how these will be phrased out. At the prior COP conference in Belém, it closed without any political text mentioning fossil fuel phase out. It didn't mention phase down. It didn't provide a pathway to end deforestation. And the conversations now are truly shifting to how can we? And that's a very different type of conversation. So the work that Sean's been doing, that Gordian's been doing, and that a lot of these inspiring countries have been doing, 57 countries that came to this conference, are proving that people are hungry for regeneration and peace.
The one thing I want to include in this is, before we pivot to the next question, that really stands out to me is the fact that France came in and they said, this is our plan. And a country as big as France, with an economy as big as France, could be reaction to the war in the Middle East right now, or it could be a few other things. But the fact that a country that has its global scope as wide and as powerful as France does says, this is what we're doing, this is how we're transitioning out over the next couple of decades, for me was just like, whoa, this is a major, major announcement. And the trickle-down effect from that, because of the fact of France's partnerships and agreements that they have with other countries, I think is really going to be a catalyst for other countries to follow suit. And as Sean said, not just aspirational, but investable, because of the milestones and the levers along the way that they've designed inside of their plan. So I'm very excited about that one. That's a big change from a lot of talk. There's legitimate plan on paper.
And we're all still tied to the Paris Agreement, so it makes good sense that France would step up to do this.
For sure.
And it's hard to do, and they did, and that's an inspiring step by France. Great to see it.
The point I want to make is that, yes, fantastic France was there. What I loved was the fact that some of the countries, and I won't name them, but some of the invitees who attended, who participated, who meaningfully contributed to the dialogue in Colombia, were the same ones that declined from issuing a statement in the last COP around fossil fuel phase out. That's a shift. And I think these convenings like Santa Marta, they give, I don't want to say safe harbor, but they give the opportunity for people, for countries to come together and have a meaningful conversation that's not negotiation oriented, but is actually around a discussion, and meaningfully engage those same parties that resisted signing on at the COP. That was great.
That is great. Such a different atmosphere.
Yeah,
it's wild.
totally.
It really is. Okay, Sean, the next one's for you. You've been very vocal about Article 6 and the voluntary carbon market being used to accelerate real economy transition. rather than extend fossil dependency. Obviously, carbon markets, that's core territory for us at Gordian Knot Strategies. So, given that frame, how does that reorient the kind of screening and project development work that we do, particularly for developers who are building pipelines in fossil adjacent economies?
Look, it raises the bar quite significantly because now the question is no longer whether a high integrity project can generate credits. And I don't mean to undermine the, the level of effort that's required there. But now the question is whether that project meaningfully contributes to a structural transition in that host country, or whether it functions as a financial sidecar to continued fossil fuel dependence. So what this means in practice is that screening has to look beyond the accounting models, and it has to ask whether a project can meaningfully shift the underlying development model for their country. In other words, does it support renewable substitution? Does it support industrial decarbonization, resilient land use, community energy access, or ecological restoration tied to transition planning? Or does it simply create a green narrative around an economy that is otherwise staying locked into fossil extraction and fossil linked infrastructure? Those are big questions, of course, for any project developer to consider, given the plethora of criteria that they have to adhere to when building a high integrity project. But Santa Marta has shifted the emphasis now. If we want to call on the voluntary carbon market as a contributor, then we have to ask this question. These questions, I should say. And so Santa Marta is important because it's connecting the roadmap to finance system reform, international cooperation that includes support for countries trying to transition in real time. And so in that context, Article 6 under the Paris Agreement and the voluntary carbon market should absolutely be used as catalytic tools inside a broader transition architecture, and for sure, not as standalone instruments. And for us at Gordian, that means stronger transition alignment screening, stronger safeguards against prolonged fossil fuel dependency, and way more emphasis on whether projects sit inside credible national or sub-national pathways. And then, of course, the level to which those projects support the local communities, indigenous communities. That was one of the key things with the presence of the indigenous communities at Santa Marta. Their voice was heard. And so that has to be populated in terms of project development. So in practical terms, what does this mean? As many of you will know, Gordian created a predictive analytical impact scoring framework called TRARO. It's powered by AI, and essentially it helps speed and accelerate the ability to assess project investment opportunities so that they're comparable, so you can reach a decision a lot faster. What this all means to us under the TRARO umbrella is it really helps to distinguish projects that are transition enabling and that from projects that are transition delaying. And that distinction is going to matter more and more as Article 6 and its mechanisms develop, and as buyers become way more sensitive to integrity and real economy outcomes coupled with social safeguards.
And as countries start to divert in their pathways towards transitioning away from fossils or continuing down that path.
Yeah.
Which will, of course, play into the Traro framework and the decisions that developers make if they decide to opt in for a project or opt out.
Exactly.
Carrie, any thoughts on this one?
Well, I've been most fascinated from a higher perspective of how all of these projects, yes, these new economic frameworks for countries, for ways that countries work together, play into the bigger picture of how we want the world to be. And I spent some time in the Middle East recently, and I had to flee. And a lot of this feeling that I've been studying lately came about how do we have regenerative economies of peace? After this conference closed, we published an article called The Regenerative Architecture in Sliced, and it goes over for the first time at sovereign scale the regenerative pattern, understanding that it got applied prospectively rather than read out of restoration history here at the conference. And it took place at the foot of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the highest coastal mountain range in the world, home to indigenous nations who have lived there for millennia. And the environmental minister opened the conference naming fossil colonialism as the pattern that needs to end. This happened to be in Colombia. I spent some time there a few years ago, and they put their work where their where their words are. They do what they're going to say. They brought the temperature down in the city of Medellin by 2 degrees Celsius within 3 years by greening the city. And so that's been inspiring to see, but that's a very small scale thing. How do we make these frameworks actually be a part of the future that lets us work together? So the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, which seeded the conference, framed managed fossil decline as the final act of strategic peacemaking. And that was part of the point that Sean was alluding to. In addition to the monetary aspects of keeping countries afloat, there are many other aspects of balancing our society that come from this. And we can choose to model after some of the archaic systems that brought us extraction and quick growth in the past, or we can develop these regenerative economies of peace. So that's what this global cooperation actually requires going forward. In our piece back in April called The Regenerative Dividend, we studied 3 histories where environmental restoration created the conditions for durable cooperation: the Mao Forests, the Rhine, the Sahel, and Santa Marta was where that retrospective pattern is getting applied. So the carbon sink and the conflict deterrent are the same asset, and the architecture for routing capital towards that is where the next decade of sovereign and cross-border finance has to live.
And given all of that, Kerry, from your perspective, do you believe that there is a real peace and stability premium that the managed decline frameworks that you're referencing can actually capture? And what would it take for the sovereign and corporate risk pricing to actually internalize the premium?
I think I'm going to let Sean speak that from a framework perspective, but this is the whole point, right? Peaceful economies that work together. And what do we decide to build our economies upon? Are we building economies on make more money than your neighbor, keeping up with the Joneses, economies of defense and offense? Or are we finding out how to work together as our pale blue dot? If we want to get more specific about the types of frameworks that are going to work with that, I would like to defer to Sean's expertise, but all of us just need to reframe the bigger picture of why we're even doing this.
Thanks, Gary. I would say we're seeing it happen real time, right? At Santa Marta, the country representatives at this conference repeatedly linked fossil fuel reliance to price shocks, insecurity, structural instability. So they are recognizing the costs that are being brought to bear. So they've made something visible that, while it's been true to us, in the marketplace, I guess, for a long time, but they've made it visible that macroeconomic and geopolitical vulnerability exists because we have not addressed this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we approach managed decline frameworks that successfully capture value by reducing exposure to import volatility, reducing the fiscal fragility that comes from this overdependence on commodity rents, lowering sensitivity to these geopolitical choke points or flare-ups, this is not abstract. It goes directly to sovereign resilience, cost of capital, long-term competitiveness amongst nations. And so if you ask, what does it take for those markets to internalize that? I would venture there are 3 things. First, better transition risk metrics that integrate energy security, fiscal dependence, and geopolitical exposure. And second, more explicit treatment by MDBs and DFIs, insurers and rating agencies of, and this is important, of the downside risks of fossil concentration. And then third, these country roadmaps that make the diversification pathway legible enough for finance to respond. And this point I want to emphasize. I was in Frankfurt at a conference on investing in climate solutions last week. In the room, there was finance, and the overarching question was, there is finance. How do we engage? How do we respond? Santa Marta is beginning to reveal that for us by showing us that these country roadmaps can be voluntarily designed and offered up. So the phrase I would use is this: managed fossil decline should increasingly be seen as a peace and stability asset class, not just as a decarbonization agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And once that lens becomes way more common in sovereign and corporate risk work, a lot of financial logic then begins to shift positively.
And the premium will become real.
Exactly.
It's absolutely there for the taking if it is designed correctly. I mean, if you think on a very practical sense, any investor, any debt agency are going to be much more inclined to approve any sort of finance in a country that has this framework built out and that can prove that the peace and stability premium is real. It's just, to me, it's a no-brainer. So it's a matter of actually being able to price it in. And I think we're going to see it. I think we're going to see it in the next 12 months. And we're going to see a couple leader countries make this happen.
With the rapidly developing clarity in these frameworks, investors get to choose where they put their money and what world do they want to see tomorrow. So I think this is a really good point there. And we're grateful that these developments are taking place so rapidly. One other aspect of framework development that I think is really important bringing into these investable markets is biodiversity. Much of our extractive economic systems of the past would put a monoculture and call it a forest. Carbon plantations that were identical eucalyptus marching in rows where ecosystems used to live. I'm looking out my window right now. I'm in central Portugal at the moment, and I see eucalyptus, and I don't see birds. I don't see animals there. And we can choose to do better, and it may cost a little bit more, but you can choose where you put your money. So if our regenerative economy reproduces those patterns, the future would read with the same intent, dressed in a different language and a failure. So I think what separates this regenerative economy that we get to choose now from a greenwash continuation comes down to three principles. Restoration goes preferentially to degraded lands, not the conversion of intact systems. Installations are multi-use by design, weaving carbon, biodiversity, livelihoods, watershed integrity, and cultural value into a single landscape. And governance also brings indigenous communities and local residents in as partners, not just as people that might benefit if the project works, because I've seen a lot of that. But at the conference itself, we did see indigenous delegates that pushed for non-extraction within their territories. WWF, IUCN both positioned phase out as multi-benefit move addressing biodiversity loss alongside climate. So the geometry of this next economy is being chosen in places where the choice is still open. And so we get to now choose what that economy of our future looks like. And I'd love to hear anything from Sean on how biodiversity could possibly be weaved into this, but that's something that felt really important to bring up in the framework conversations as well.
Yeah, I can weigh in. I think, again, talking about what the conference succeeded at making visible, it made this idea that extraction in ecologically critical regions is not just a local land issue. It is a systemic climate, biodiversity, and resilience issue. And what this does is it changes the way we approach natural capital thinking in a pragmatic way, where it means that natural capital, we can't just treat it as an opportunity set for restoration or conservation finance on one side, while fossil extraction risk is analyzed completely separately on the other. In high-value ecosystems, these are two sides of the same balance sheet. And so once you see it that way, climate finance and nature finance should start converging around place-based transition architecture, the very thing these country roadmaps are talking about. And so that means asking not just how to fund restoration, but how to finance non-extraction, economic substitution, community resilience, right-based stewardship in landscapes where fossil expansion would destroy both ecological integrity and future development options. So I think Santa Marta moved the needle for me on that.
Thank you both for that. That was helpful framing from each of you there. And as we're getting towards the end of the episode, the last question, and I want both of you to take a stab at this if you don't mind. It's based around where do we go from here and who do we believe are best positioned to serve? Because this conference now has the second officially scheduled in 2027. Co-hosts are going to be Ireland and Tuvalu. So this is now becoming a standing forum. So if we take everything that Santa Marta had set in motion, so the roadmap process, the finance architecture questions, the just transition demands, who do you guys believe are the governments, investors, and partners in emerging and frontier markets that Gordian Strategies is most aligned to support right now?
Kerry, you want to go ahead?
We're inspired by the markets that are rapidly able to change and adjust their policies based on the things that are working now. And we've seen a lot of change in these markets in the last few years. And we want to support those that have the will to adapt. And in some cases, that means those that are most affected. If we look at Tuvalu, if we look at the South Pacific, if we look at the Caribbean. But we also see so much opportunity in some of the less developed countries where there are so many projects that need funding, that need verification, that need standardization. So I'm excited about supporting the projects, the governments, and the transition between more developed economies and governments to bring the opportunities about from what we're learning so rapidly. So I think we're open-minded to supporting those who really want to see these kinds of change in regeneration, in biodiversity, in development of peace economies. But there's so much potential here. And I just leave this conversation and understanding of what's coming next truly inspired and looking forward to supporting however we can.
Thanks, Kerry. Yes, I think from a pragmatic point of view, to answer your question, Jay, and of course, this is near and dear to us at Gordian because these are the folks that we work with. They're essentially, I would categorize them as three groups out of those horizon that Kerry described for us, where the first group are those governments and public institutions in emerging and frontier markets that, as Kerry said, want to change. They want to move the needle. And so in practical term, that means these countries need hands-on support, designing credible roadmaps, translating those into financeable pipelines, something we absolutely love doing, and then aligning climate, energy, debt, natural capital strategies rather than treating them as separate silos. So really looking at it holistically for a government, for a country, for a province. The second group are the investors, development finance institutions, and catalytic capital providers, where they recognize that managed fossil fuel decline is not a niche topic anymore. It's becoming a core question of sovereign resilience and industrial competitiveness. And so these actors, they need a ton of support for improved screening, way sharper structuring, stronger frameworks for evaluating what transition alignment actually looks like in these really complex real-world economies. And then the third group is civil society, indigenous and mission-driven implementation partners that we work with around the world, who are trying to ensure that this transition is indeed rights-based, economically credible, with integrity, and importantly, grounded in place. And so Santa Marta showed us that these voices are not peripheral. They are central to whether the transition frameworks are legitimate and durable. And so for the question as to where do we go from here, my hope and my enthusiasm is to turn the Santa Marta signal into really investable architecture.
Yes, we need to transition not just from fossil fuels into clean energy systems, but transition from aspiration to action.
That's it.
And I think that that's where Santa Marta is pointing us in that direction. So we're gonna remain vigilant at Gordian Knot Strategies and keep our eyes on what's happening in the market. And Kerry, as I know you do a great job of paying attention to who's doing what and to building bridges and connections with those folks. And so I have no doubt that something will come from the work that was just done at the conference, and hopefully Gordian can get involved. Gentlemen, any final words from either of you as we wrap this episode up?
I feel the writing is on the wall. We see where finance is going. We see where global stability has been challenged. And we understand where investment and types of investment and outcomes from it really bring us to the kind of world that we want to live in. And those that are in the existing frameworks, the grandfathered frameworks, can choose to shift now and move their marbles over to the side of being proactive and productive and developing these regenerative economies of peace, or they'll miss out. They'll be left behind, and they can choose to allocate those assets towards regenerative development if they'd like to. So an encouragement to the old world who is keeping their money stuck in things that degenerate. We don't have to do that. Take a tip from Santa Marta, and let's put our money where our mouth is and begin this economy this world, this regenerative economy of peace that we've chosen.
Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, I share the same outlook. I would make two observations as closing thoughts. One, recognizing the frustration that we've all felt, but have sort of felt powerless to change. And that is, we've witnessed these these annual climate events. They come, they go, nothing really moves. People wordsmith agonizingly over 2 words in a paragraph, and then another year comes. And so the observation is, well done to the organizers of Santa Marta, because they broke the mold. They approached dialogue in an entirely different way. And the attendees at Santa Marta commented many, many times just how empowering and invigorating and meaningfully productive that environment was when they compare it to the more traditional COPs that they've attended. So that's the one. The other closing thought, and this aligns with what you said, Kerry, is that, the writing's on the wall. It is. This is all about managing risk. That's all it is. This is clear-eyed risk management. And if you've got a critical group of 57 countries who are harmonizing around a common outlook with a very concerted effort to develop a roadmap that is going to take them down this new road, anyone with capital, anywhere in the world, has got to look at that and say, what do I do to mitigate my risk? Because this is a train that is coming.
Agreed.
Beautifully said, fellas. You guys knocked it out of the park. Very impressed with both of you. I want to say that I'm thankful that you guys carved out some of your time today to share your thoughts on the Santa Marta conference. And Sean, it's always good to have you on the episode. 3rd time's a charm. Kerry, I look forward to having you back again soon. And keep up your great work with your LinkedIn posts and your articles and your essays. I find them particularly to be very inspirational. So thank you both.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Inspired.
Pleasure. Thanks, Jay.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. And honestly, one of my favorites that we've done thus far. Sean, Kerry, thank you both. What I'll be taking away from this convo is something Sean said near the end. Santa Marta didn't solve everything, but it made inaction look less prudent. And in a world that has spent years wordsmithing around fossil fuel phase-out, that shift in the burden of proof is no small thing. If today's combo sparked something for you, whether you're a government, an investor, a project developer, or a civil society partner working in emerging or frontier markets, reach out to the team at Gordian Strategies. This is exactly the work we do, and exactly the moment to be doing it. You can find us at gordian.strategies.com, or you can email me personally at jtipton@gordian.strategies.com. My email is in the show notes. Finally, if you've enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone who you think needs to hear it. We need those algorithms on our side. I'll be back next month with another conversation on climate finance. Until then, keep pushing. This podcast is brought to you by Gordian Strategies.